Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to Robert's Sports Show. I'm your host, Robert. Alright, as we are counting down until the 2023 Daytona 500, we are 96 days away. We just had the champion profile, Larry Pearson, up yesterday. Today we got NASCAR by the decade, the 1980s. 1980s probably had the least amount of races of any decade, except obviously the 40s. But it was, to me, as a fan, I came in the 80s. I came in 86, 87, and really started paying attention in 88. I was 11 years old, watching Bobby Allison win the Daytona 500, followed by his son Davey. So a lot of the 80s and going forward is stuff that I know. You know, that's what I grew up watching and following. And so it's cool in the 50s, 60s, and 70s looking back and learning who some of these guys were and seeing names that I've never seen before, doing all the research I do for this stuff. But yeah, this is kind of in the time where you watch the growth of NASCAR. You know, 1979, we had the first ever flight-to-flight coverage on CBS at Daytona 500. We had the fight. They're fighting because they have lost. You know, that great call. And then seeing Bobby and Cale fighting, and Cale hitting Bobby, taking his nose and beating on Bobby's fist, and that kind of sparked the 80s, and we had a kind of a transition in drivers from the Bobby Allisons, Cale Yarborough, Richard Petty's to the Earnhardt, Waltrip, Wallace, Elliott, and it's kind of, you see that transition in the 80s to the kind of a younger driver, different demographic driver-wise. The speeds of the car obviously went up, and then we restrictor plated them after some major wrecks, and then it's kind of like you kind of look back on like, oh my God, in the 80s, some of the drivers that came in. Kyle Petty, Tim Richmond, Sterling Marlin, Mark Martin, Jeff Bodine, Rusty Wallace, Davey Allison, Alan Quickie, Ken Schrader, Jimmy Spencer. These are guys that we learned about in the 80s. The 80s also offered 2 3-time champions. Dale Earnhardt won 3 championships during the 1980s. Darrell Waltrip, Jaws, won 3 championships in the 80s. Bobby Allison, Terry Labonte, Bill Elliott, and Rusty Wallace each won. The very first race of the 80s was January 13th. You heard me correctly. January 13th, 1980. We finished it January 19th, 1980. It was a Winston Western 500 at Riverside. It was rained out when we finished it a week later. The last race of the 80s, November 19th, 1989, the Atlanta Journal 500. Dale Earnhardt getting the victory. That's when Rusty Wallace clinched his championship, one and only championship. During the decade, we had 296 races, the least amount of any decade. 354 different drivers started a Cup Series race. We had 269 drivers with 2 or more starts, 128 drivers with 10 or more starts, 58 drivers with 50 or more, 39 drivers with 100 or more starts, and then 17 drivers had 200 or more starts during the decade. Dale Earnhardt, Terry Labonte, Darrell Waltrip all started 296 races, everything of the 1980s. Dave Marcus, 294. The King, Richard Petty, 292. He did miss 4 races in 1987, did not qualify. And that's the biggest thing that's kind of looking back on some of this, is seeing the decline of people like Richard Petty, Bobby Allison, Neil Bonnet. You kind of see guys that were there in the 70s now is kind of getting older. The drivers are changing, the cars are changing. This, in 1981 was the last year for the Gen 2 car. Harry Gant, 291 starts. Ricky Rudd, 278. Jimmy Means, 269. Kyle Petty, 269. Neil Bonnet, 264. Starts without a win. These drivers ran X number of races that decade with no wins. Jimmy Means, 269. Buddy Arrington, 224. J.D. McDuffie, 199. Joe Ruttman, 176. Sterling Marlin, 157. Ronnie Thomas, 136. Thomas Gale, 130. Michael Waltrip, 120. Rick Wilson, 115. Eddie Beach Royal, 105. Wins for the decade. By far, the most wins in the decade was Darrell Waltrip, 57. That was driving for Dygaard and for Junior Johnson. And he ended the 80s driving for Rick Hendrick. Dale Earnhardt with 38. Bill Elliott, 32. Bobby Allison, 28. Cale Yarborough, 20. Rusty Wallace, 16. Neil Bonnet, 13. Tim Richmond, 13. Harry Gant, Richard Petty, Terry Labonte, and Ricky Rudd each had 10. The best winning percentage for drivers during this decade. ODW, Darrell Waltrip, 19.2% of his starts he won. 296 starts, 57 wins. Cale Yarborough, 12.9%. Bill Elliott, 12.8%. Dale Earnhardt, 12.8%. Bobby Allison, 11.1%. Rusty Wallace, 8.7%. 16 wins, 183 starts. Tim Richmond, 7%. 13 wins, 185 starts. Neil Bonnet, 4.9%. 13 wins, 264 starts. Ricky Rudd, 3.6%. And then Benny Parsons, 3.4%. The best average finish for the decade also goes to Jaws, Darrell Waltrip. And for those of you who have been a fan of the sport for a long time, you know the Jaws nickname came from the 70s when he just wouldn't shut up. And even through his driving career in the 80s and 90s, when he turned into an owner, I mean, who do not remember Darrell Waltrip? They'd interview him, and they'd be like, who we talk to, the owner or the driver? Talking to the driver. We talk to the owner, turn his head on backward. Now, I tell you, that driver I got, he doesn't know crack. He turned to Darrell Waltrip, the owner. It's like, oh my God, this guy's hilarious. Which, well, I got to see that when he was on Fox doing the races and stuff. Bill Elliott, 10.9 average finish. Dale Earnhardt, 11.2. Bobby Allison, 11.8. Texas Terry Labonte, 12.4. Rusty Wallace, 14.0. The Iron Man, Ricky Rudd, 14.2. Neil Bonnet, 14.8. Harry Gant, Mr. September, 15. Tim Richmond, 15.1. That is the 1980s NASCAR by the decade, 96 days away from the 2023 Daytona 500. As always, thanks for watching Robert Sports Show. Don't just have a great day. Have a spiffy day. Robert Sports Show, your YouTube leader in sports channel content.